First of all, I want to thank the school for inviting me to do this, because this is as exciting for me as it is for all of you, I'm sure. And we have spent how many weeks working out exactly precisely what we would do?
It's a long time.
Yeah, long time. No, in the spirit of jazz, this whole thing will be improvised. Starting with a question I would like to throw out, and I think this is especially basic for people who study instruments, and we talked a little about this backstage, that when you study an instrument, the idea is to play what's on the page and to play it accurately. When you play jazz, the idea is not to be on the page. You might be partially on the page, you might be varying degrees on the page, you might be completely off the page. So my question is, for each of you, where in your life did you get off the page?
I like the way you said that. Boy, that's really interesting. I guess for me, it was a specific moment because I had very typical piano lessons. We were comparing our piano lessons when we were kids, what we both had. And I got into ragtime because I heard some of that, and I was playing that like the page pretty much. And then I got a job very close to here at the Balboa Pavilion. That was my first piano job because I grew up here. And I was just really lucky. Someone came in and said, I think you're going to really like this. And it was just a sensitive listener. And he gave me a cassette of early Count Basie, before he was Count Basie, when he was still Bill Basie. And it was a tune, I remember it specifically. It was Prince of Wales with Benny Moten's band. And I went crazy. I just loved it. I thought I want to teach myself how to do it. So I didn't know anything about harmony or keys or anything. I just sat with that cassette, sat in a room and taught myself, picked it apart. So I was off the page completely. That completely changed my life. So it was a specific moment.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I grew up in a musical family. My father's a guitarist, and he's a jazz guitarist. And he used to play with Chico Hamilton, who was one of the first jazz artists that actually had a cellist in his group, kind of radical. Also included Eric Dolphy, great bass clarinetist. And played with Shearing as well, George Shearing. And I remember going on the road with him when I was about the age of 7. But my musical inclination started after hearing Andre Segovia at the age of 6. And I remember going home and thinking, I really want to do this. So he set up these classical guitar lessons for me. And I was fine playing on the page at that age because, I was playing Bach, I was playing all these great pieces. So you can find yourself in those pieces as well. But when I got to junior high, we had a great jazz program at Eagle Rock High School. And a lot of my buddies were getting interested in this stuff called jazz. So for me, I came to this music from a social perspective. For me, it was a way to connect with my friends and share our identities, embodied in music. So that's how I came to it. It was a social experiment for me, finding that freedom with my friends.
It's so interesting. I'm just thinking about it as you're saying it was social, because mine was all about sitting in a room for hours. So mine was the exact opposite. Mine was sitting there in that room with that tape and going over and over with it, which you do, all jazz musicians do, but still to start, that's really interesting.
Well, the aspect, the reason I bring the social aspect up is because it really is, there's a social dynamic to playing. I mean, there's communication, there's empathy, there's someone holding court while you accompany them, there's all those things are in play. So that's what I love about this music.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The social aspect. So we're talking about acquiring the knowledge that there are things you must know. Now, I happen to know something about Larry, a distinction, as a matter of fact, the first to receive a jazz studies degree from the University of Southern California Thornton School of Music. So, I mean, that sounds like the Wild West days when people roamed the streets with 6 guns and somebody said, I think I'd like to get me a jazz degree. So what was that like?
When I first went to USC, first of all, the program was fantastic, and I was initially a classical guitar major and toying with the notion of maybe doing a double major, classical guitar and what they called studio guitar at that time. And that's when, in Los Angeles, it was really viable to make a living as a studio musician. There was tons of work. So as I got involved in the program, I got more interested in playing jazz. Again, the social aspect reared its head. And I also heard at that point some serious classical guitarists and knew that I would have to dedicate a lot more time than I had dedicated up to that point to really get on that level. So they were toying with having a jazz studies degree at that time. It was kind of in its initial phases. They didn't even have a curriculum, really. So I was kind of an experiment. And so they just threw it out there. You know, would you like to be the first person to get this degree? And it just felt natural to kind of go into that. Yeah.
So let me ask you then, you started really with your ear, right?
Yes.
You know, you didn't work. So how did you acquire all of the other knowledge? How did that happen?
It's really crazy. As I said, I got this job here, and I laugh about it because I only knew 5 tunes when I had my first professional job, and 4 of them were Maple Leaf Rag.
Okay, what was the 5th one?
Yeah.
The Entertainer?
I can tell you, I remember, no ballads. It was all memorized from the music, so I played Dizzy Fingers, Bumble Boogie, Maple Leaf Rag, Kitten on the Keys, and Nola. So they were all these things that I'd memorized when you and I were doing the John Thompson books. And so I had these things, so I had gotten great technique because those are all hard to play. And I played one song, and I was going to play on the other pianist's night off, so he never came back to hear me. He thought he inferred I knew 50 tunes or something. And so I started, once I got the job, I started trying, and I was just playing ragtime. And if a musician came in, I would ask him what key I was in because I didn't know. And then I started playing and seeing patterns. And I remember the day I actually first recognized how the chords all worked together, figured that out. Then I got that bassy tape and then started going more into jazz and saw that they were actually improvising and just started listening. For me, it was really meeting other musicians who came in and said, if you like this, you're going to like that. And just a lot of listening and
So
teaching.
intuition, right?
Yeah.
Intuition. You know, it's funny, I wasn't going to toss in a personal story, but you mentioned you didn't know what key you were in. Back when I was in school, and I got sent out sometimes to play piano and sometimes to play bass, because I played both. And there was a trumpet player. His name was Frank. And Frank, the trumpet player, would call out the key of the tune we're going to play. And so he called out the key of some tune, and it was not remotely the key that I was used to playing in. So I started playing it in the key that he said, and it was entirely wrong. It turned out that Frank was telling me his first note for a B-flat trumpet. So there was no way of deciphering exactly, unless you had a cryptography degree, exactly what was going on. But the whole notion is that you don't need the academic background, but you do need something. You need an awareness, you need an ear, you need intuition, and then there's that thing called, let's call it feel, or we could call it swing, or we call it feel, that not everybody seems to have.
Yeah.
So where does it come from? How'd you develop
I think
it?
it's interesting because it wasn't something that I realized till much later in my career, but I grew up obsessed with old movies. And as I said, I grew up here, and when I was a kid, you probably remember this, there was something called the $1 Million Movie, and they would play...
Channel 9, WOR New York.
Yep,
but
there
you got
you
it
go.
out here.
But it was the
Okay.
same things, and they would play the same movie exactly. So I am remembering that right. So they play the same movie for 7 days straight, 3 times a day. So I would watch it every single time. And so I watched all the Fred Astaire movies. I memorized all those tunes. I'm dancing in front of the TV. So it's only many years later that I realized that when I heard that bassy thing, the reason it hit was because it was the jazz version of those early movies. And so I did grow up in a way in the 30s, in those movies. And because I knew all those lyrics, I knew those tunes. And so for me, that's why I had the feel. And I think we were talking earlier when we were backstage that when my piano teacher was giving me lessons, she'd be mad because I would swing everything. And it's because that's what I felt. I was hearing this real swing feel. So that's how I got the feel. And then I started listening to lots of jazz. But that era, everything was jazz. You know, yeah.
The
So
thing
for me,
too is that improvisation used to be a standard part of what we call classical
Right,
training. You
right,
go back
right,
to the
right,
Baroque
yeah.
period and the classical period, especially in the Baroque. The idea is you don't have chord symbols, you've got figured bass, you've got a shorthand, you've got to create the part, you've got to listen, you've got to interact. Some fascinating stuff. Mozart, as a matter of fact, used to routinely, if he just finished a piece in the key of B flat, was going to play a piece in the key of D, he would improvise the connection. You wouldn't just leave B flat behind and go to D. So these are all skills that jazz musicians are required to have. And it's coming back into the mainstream a little more in academic classical circles, but not like it once was. Which leads me to a question for you, and that is, how do you see that intersection in your own life between the classical and the jazz?
Great question. You know, it's interesting to me because when I think of feel, the classical artists that I used to listen to, Horowitz and Heifetz and Julian Bream, it's all about feel. I mean, you can really sense the identity of the person that, you know, behind what you're hearing. So there's not much of a distinction other than maybe the fact that I can tap my toes on 2 and 4. I love the fact that, you know, you can feel that time viscerally when you're playing, and it's more of a, I guess visceral is a good word. There's more, you know, in classical music there's a lot of expansion and contraction with phrases. And it's not usually felt in the same way as we feel jazz music, in that, you know, you feel this backbeat, 2 and 4, and there's sort of there's a dance to that, and I feel it in the body. It's a body knowledge. It's not a head knowledge. It's a body knowledge. In fact, where I teach at Cal Arts, there's an African music program, and the African music program, I think, embodies rhythm in the deepest way that I've ever experienced. It's got all the complications of, you know, Indian-based music, in that there's these incredible polyrhythms, but it's all taught from the sense of feel and sound. And I love that. Nothing's on the page. You know, it's always three-dimensional. We had this master teacher at Cal Arts named Alfred Letsekpo, who was a chief from Ghana. And, you know, I used to ask him about, you know, this music all the time because I felt like a baby rhythmically compared to him. And he said, well, most Western notions of time are one-dimensional. You know, they're all about placement. You know, and time is so much more than placement. It's emotion, you know, and it's how you shape the experience.
I want to say one more thing on the feel too. I'm thinking, because I know a lot of classical players, because I get this a lot, and I'm sure both of you do, they want to play jazz, but they're not listening to any jazz. They just want to instantly play it. And even if they can figure out the theory of improvisation and memorize a lot of lines or scales or things, it's all about that listening and feel. And I know you've had it, I've had it. I played with a bass player in England that is great, named Dave Green, and this was years ago, and it was an out-of-body experience for me, because his sense of time was so deep that I almost hurt myself. I was so excited. I kept taking chorus after chorus. I was like, yeah, more. And so I did it, and I thought, okay, I'm never gonna be the same, but it's only going to happen when I get to play with Dave again. But then I came back to America, and the next gig I did with my regular guys, they were like, what happened to you? And now it was in there. There was this different, I had discovered a different feel that went deeper. And so I say to all of you out there who have never played jazz but are interested in jazz, that it really starts with lots of listening and then just play simply. Everybody goes to that fancy place. Go to the simple place and just try to play along and feel what's going on. And I loved you saying the body thing, because I had a piano player that wanted to hire me just to teach him how to swing, and I kept winding up massaging his shoulders to get him to just, you know, get his,
Get him to loosen up.
Yeah, to loosen up. It was really, but I say that for those that want to learn it. Listening and getting that feel and trying to play with it. Don't you think that's true?
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. No, I was taking one thing about contraction and expansion in classical repertoire, and that's for anybody who's studying. Of course, you're already not playing what's on the page. And the proof of that is you take your music publishing software, you create your score, and you say, I'm going to play it back, and you get it played back metronomically, and you say, well, that's the most horrible thing I've ever heard, of course. And nobody plays metronomically, you know, whether you are aware of it or not. So there's already that freedom. And so everybody's a little aware of the social media thing, and that's important for classical artists as well. There's a pianist named Valentina Lisitsa, who launched her career with an out-of-tune piano on a low-quality video on YouTube, and now she has hundreds of thousands of followers and a career. But I mean, the opportunities are there in a way that they didn't used to be. Of course, at the same time, there's a lot of noise out there.
Yeah,
you know,
and that's something
you have
I want
to rise above the above
And
the
I think you need to
landscape.
be realistic. I think that, and I say realistic, and I always say get someone around you that you know is great, that you admire, not your mother. Somebody who will be honest with you.
Although you do admire your mother.
Yes. Oh, I admire my mother, and it's nice that your mother supports you. But I think that the danger with all this social media and access, I try to watch these things because people like you. I have a radio show, and people will send me things. And somebody recently, it's epitomized in this, and she's beautiful, and she plays saxophone, and she sings, and so it was a video, and it was beautifully shot. I mean, it was like Scorsese. She just had everything there, and she's all sexy, and she was horrible, absolutely horrible. And I thought, she's probably about 26, 27, and I thought, the old guys, now we talk about it, Larry and I are very fortunate because we're the generation who's actually, when we were very young, the people who invented jazz were still alive. We got to meet a lot of those people. And I was thinking, if I had said to any of those people, like if I'd said to Freddie Green, I'm thinking of making a film, he would have gone, you're not ready. You know, and you have to have it just because you can. And it shouldn't be fast. Sophisticated music takes a long time, and it should, to get good at it, whether it's classical, whether it's Brazilian, whether it's what we're doing. It's not something that's instant just because you can get yourself out there instantly. Maybe you shouldn't get yourself out there instantly. So that's my little word.
That prompts another idea, and that is that, and I know this is very important to you, that for many types of popular music, there is a prevalent style, and style awareness and style interest goes back maybe a few weeks and maybe a couple of years. But in jazz, the tendency is to embrace the totality of it. I know that was important to you, and especially when we hear you play, which I will insist both of you do before too much time goes by, that you were very committed to embracing the history. You know, and it is embraceable. We don't have to go back, you know, into all eternity. We go back to, you know, the beginning of the 20th century, and we find it happening. So, how did you go about schooling yourself in all of that? Yeah.
Well, for me, it was something that I connected because I was passionate about it. It wasn't even on purpose. It was something that I just, I heard ragtime, I liked it, and so I started with the beginning. Then I heard Basie, and that was the next thing, and then I sort of going through it. But I think one of the pitfalls, because you say the history of jazz is so short, you can embrace all of it, at least listen to it and be introduced to it. And I think, and I'd love to hear what you think about this, but I think of some of the people that we really loved, of those, like the second generation, we'll say Tommy Flanagan, Hank Jones, people like that, they had the depth of those early players. So when I'd hear somebody like a Tommy Flanagan, who was a great jazz pianist, but he wouldn't literally play stride piano and play like from the earlier things like that, but he was in there, you heard it. You know that he'd embraced it. And I think it's one of the things that a lot of people think jazz started in 1965 or something. And it doesn't mean that you have to play it literally, the vocabulary, like I happen to be really into, but you should have listened to it and embraced what was that about. At least explore it a bit, I think, because I think it gives just more depth to everything. And so that, for me, I keyed in on what really spoke to me, and now I'm sort of working my way through the years because now I'm singing and stride doesn't work as well for my singing, so now I'm doing less. So I think you evolve naturally with what your ears are telling you, and that's a great thing about jazz too, because then you develop an individual style just by playing what you're hearing, what appeals to you. It will happen.
Am I piggybacking on you? Okay. So, yeah, I think it's important to go back in history, but I don't emphasize it as the end-all, be-all, because people are coming from so many different places. Like, for example, I found out about the music of Louis Armstrong relatively late. I was always a big fan of Basie, but the earlier small ensemble stuff for me was sort of a revelation later, you know? And it's beautiful stuff. I really love it. But I think the most important aspect in terms of the historical perspective on this music is to just understand how rhythm works. It's mainly rhythm-based, you know. The harmony and the melody actually existed almost with, you know, every classical, so many different classical composers that I can even cite, Ravel and Debussy, and even, you know, Gershwin was writing bluesy stuff. I mean, it's not that the harmonic and melodic vocabulary was completely new. It was mainly the rhythmic innovation. So, you know, to learn from the way these early jazzers played, Louis Armstrong, and then later on Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie and Bill Powell, Bud Powell. I'm thinking of a graduate or a teacher from Cal Arts. That's really the lesson, to understand the feeling of that music, the rhythmic aspect. I think that's the